So welcome everybody. Thank you very much for attending this discussion. So I wanted to start with a very simple question. First, I wanted to ask Dieter and Abi to say a few words how this concept came about, because I think not everybody knows. And then I wanted to kind of, you know, a little bit the usual standard format of discussions, which is when I ask one question, I ask everybody to, which is why this exhibition today? Why do you think it's relevant from different perspectives? Obviously, we have Abi especially is an expert in Latin American art, right? So Ieva is, you know, from Latvia and kind of representing national representation, and then we have Sasha who will speak for all the Soviet Russian artists. So yes, a little bit about how this came about.
So, are we on? Everyone hears me. So yeah, just very briefly, the genealogy of the project. It's nice that the image in the background is of a work of Abraham Palatnik, because he is actually the artist who's at the, in a way, you know, ground zero of the history of the exhibition project. Abraham Palatnik is an artist that I don't suppose many of you will be familiar with. I wasn't familiar with the work until recently. But Abraham Palatnik is a Brazilian artist. He's a canonical representative of kinetic art in Brazil, in Latin America. And as you noticed, he has a somewhat un-Brazilian sounding name, if you expect all Brazilians to be called João Fernandes. But so Abraham Palatnik was born in Recife, in Natal, in the early 20s, 1920s, to Russian Jewish parents who had basically fled Tsarist Russia in the beginning of the 20th century to rebuild their lives in Brazil. And in Brazil is where Abraham Palatnik basically, you know, kind of came of age and developed as an artist. And in the post-war era, he became one of the main protagonists of the kinetic art moment in Latin America. And it is, in a way, and this is an anecdote, but it was seeing Abraham Palatnik's work for the first time, like really looking at it for the first time, in a museum in Rio de Janeiro in 2013, in the summer of 2013, so almost 5 years ago, which planted the seed in my mind, in our mind, for this exhibition, which is an exhibition that looks at the fact that for a brief moment from the late 50s until the early 70s, there was this powerful art paradigm, this powerful art movement, op art and kinetic art, that flourished very specifically in certain countries of South America, very specifically Argentina, Brazil, and Venezuela. While at the same time it was also quite popular or quite strongly present in certain countries of Eastern Europe. Poland, a variety of Soviet republics, Hungary, and very importantly also Yugoslavia. And and this is odd. This was something that, you know, I found odd. And in a way, the oddity of this whole story was encapsulated in the fact of this name, Abraham Palatnik. You know, a Russian, Jewish, Brazilian name, and that's the beginning of this exhibition, which is called The Other Transatlantic, meaning that it is the story, an art history of transatlantic relations, but not the traditional transatlantic relation between Paris and New York or London and New York, but the slightly alternative transatlantic relation that was developed between Caracas and Budapest, Vilnius and Buenos Aires, Sao Paulo and Warsaw. And so this is an encounter that I had in 2013, in the summer of 2013, with this work, and this is in a way the birthplace and the moment of birth of the project. And perhaps Abi can say a little more about the ideological framework of our choice in a way. Why this? Yeah.
Is this on?
Yeah.
Okay. Transatlantic with a YK is also the title of a book by a Polish author named Witold Gombrowicz, which was written in the beginning of the 20th century as well, about the author's trip from Poland to Brazil. So when Dieter and I first talked about this subject, I was less surprised by the relationship between South America and Eastern Europe, because I've done quite a bit of research as an academic on the Jewish diaspora specifically in Latin America, and a number of these artists were of that diaspora, but also that these are two geographies that are experiencing modernism at the same time, or the experience of industrialization, technological advancement, the kind of changes maybe that happened in North America and Western Europe a little bit earlier, before the First World War, as opposed to after the Second World War. So this kind of differential experience of modernism in Eastern Europe and South America is obviously an influence on the artistic situation. And it's also, from an art historical perspective, these are, what we kind of look at in this exhibition is a different understanding of constructivism, how it becomes its legacy in the West versus its legacy in the East and South America. So we see this change in in Western Europe and North America toward a movement towards abstraction, which is an expression of individualism, versus a real investment in the idea of utopia that you have obviously across the street at the New Tretiakov in Russian suprematism and Russian avant-garde art. So that was a little bit the context that made these, that we suspected were influencing these two contexts and making them result in these kind of similar aesthetic expressions. That was the hunch, at least, and that was what we wanted to explore in the exhibition.
And one more thing that I want to add is that, of course, this entire exhibition, which is based on a hunch, on like an intuition that we had, is also an exercise in revalidating or reevaluating an art movement and an art form that for a long time had been marginalized in canonical Western art history. Kinetic art and op art are two art forms that for a very long time had a little bit of a, kind of a reputation for kitsch and a reputation for, novelty and gimmick and all that. It was basically, it hadn't aged well, over the years, in the 80s, 90s. Until recently, people just didn't really kind of give op art much thought anymore, kinetic art much thought anymore. And of course, this marginalization, this process of marginalization, was something that was driven primarily by art historians in the West. Once again, new American academics, London, all that. And so part of our interest in this exhibition was also to kind of, revalue or reevaluate an art movement that, in our opinion, had been marginalized unfairly. So it was something that we wanted to bring back to international global attention. And I'm very glad that it seems we've managed. Just by looking at the sheer numbers, which Snejana tells me is just a weekly routine.
Which brings me to the next question that I keep being asked is, why this show now? And I have, obviously, as an institutional curator who, was responsible for curating a group of works that have been selected, adding some, shifting something. But I have an answer of myself. But I was just wondering, what do you think? Like, you have done a lot of research in the kinetic art in Latvia, and Sasha this was something that you wanted to do for years, but you just didn't have enough time and the right motivation to bring the research to more depth. And I think this exhibition, for us at least, gives us a great again opportunity to have a bigger context than just showing Russian kinetic and art on its own. And obviously, in this part, we wanted to include the Latvian and Estonian part of the story because they were communicating a lot between themselves. So I was wondering, what is, from your perspective, the importance of, rewriting history is always important in my mind, because sometimes it's not even rewriting, it's actually writing history that did not exist, especially in our case. So yeah, you have seen the show, you just arrived, I know you have seen a little bit the show, but what do you think from your perspective? And then of course, I want to hear your opinion as well.
Yes. I think this exhibition is perfect case study of this really important work which art history is facing, and it contemporary, especially contemporary art history, but I guess also other more historical perspectives. This is really like this searching for, as you also placed it in this brief summarization of this discussion, alternative understanding what is art history, and really kind of I would say even opposing this domination of Western, really this modernism and the Western perspective, and in that sense, kinetic art I think is really perfect case study, or the field through which to do it, as also like Abi and Dieter already said, that it was really global since the very beginning, and even in a Western world it was in a way maybe forgotten so fast because it was not this dominating narrative, and in that sense through this kinetic art we suddenly see that there was extremely interesting things happening in Eastern Europe, in a former Soviet Union, also in Baltic countries and in Latvia, where I come from. And somehow my interest and my colleagues' interest about this, in our case it's more like 70s, not so much 60s, but it really was part of the huge research and wish to revisit, to understand what was happening in this 60s, 70s, 80s, which was really like this, in a way, forgotten art history, or really like put in the oblivion because of this system change, and really like we still face today that people who were like really living in these decades, they sometimes even don't want to really come back to that, and this is the task in a way of a younger generation to really to dig back again and try to see in a more kind of closer perspective what was really happening, and then suddenly to see that there were not just these local histories, but there were really like things which were all over the world, and kinetic art is really like very, very good example of that.
Sasha?
As Snejana said, it's correct. I am really interested in the history of contemporary Russian art, which I think is still not written. So our research, which we made for Soviet kinetic art, was, let's say, kind of chapter for unwritten art history. And probably one of the most complicated pages in this history, because as far as you probably know, in Soviet Union there were two general lines in art. One we call official, all kinds of paintings and sculptures, graphic arts, which were allowed to be exhibited in exhibition halls and in museums, etc. And there was another line which we call unofficial, forbidden art, which used all kinds of modernist art languages, including kinetic art. But kinetic art, in the same time, was placed through years in the midst of, let's say, in this blind zone of both major lines. It wasn't accepted as official, and it wasn't accepted as purely unofficial. so it was rejected from both sides. And on the other hand, lots of works which appeared in 60s disappeared through decades because artists didn't value these works as something significant they've done. So many artworks were destroyed and lost and forgotten, and I cannot say we brought to light a lot of unknown pieces, but I hope that we managed to put them in such a way that the meaning of these objects, which seemed to be lost, now came to the first place, and now it's visible, including, for instance, utopian perspectives. Soviet kinetic artists were looking at the art from on one side, and on another side, very light and elegant formal decisions they somehow made, being 20 years old of the age. And this complexity of kinetic art history in Soviet situation sometimes scares researchers, because it's really difficult to work with this material. And for me personally, it was also interesting how this local, very kind of provincial story will light with the background of all the other artists from Eastern Europe and Latin America, their contemporaries, with which they exhibited their works at Documenta 68 or in other exhibition of kinetic art in Zurich, I don't know when it was, the 72, Licht, Kunstlicht, never mind. Well, by the way, there were so many exhibitions of kinetic art in Europe that it's hardly to mention a half in 1 hour. But Soviet artists never visited any of these exhibitions because they were stuck at Soviet Union. They sent their works, and now suddenly in 2018 we are happy to see them together in a physical space and form. That's probably, for me, was an important point.
Well, the question, why this now? You know, why this kind of, why these historical curiosities? Why reanimate them? Why kind of present them? So again, to kind of go back a little bit to the genealogy of the project. So this exhibition was organized by the Museum of Modern Art in Warsaw. The first people that we actually talked to about the project were our colleagues in Poland, in Warsaw. And it was actually, I was in the company of Joanna Mitkowska, the director of the museum in Brazil, when I first saw this Pollock piece. And so we started talking about, you know, a potential exhibition or research project. And Joanna always kept asking, yes, but we have to, you know, she always asked, like, why should we even do it? Why bother looking back at this history? And, you know, perhaps initially it was a little not so clear why this should be of interest. But I think, you know, now, 5 years on, there's quite a few arguments, I think, that speak in favor of this exercise in historical rescue. And there's a variety of reasons, and you know, Abby will obviously also kind of attend to some of them. But the one thing that I want to remark on very quickly, perhaps, and just summarily and sketchily, is that this to me is very much an art of hope. I mean, it's an art of many things. You know, it's an art that is very open to dialogue with science, and it's an art that's very interested in kind of in public realm, and in kind of like an openness of invitation. It's an art that comes with a particular political mandate that I'm sympathetic to. But for me, the most important aspect of it is perhaps that it is an art that was born from kind of the optimist spirit that, you know, was very strongly present in the modernizing context of Latin America in the 50s and 60s, when, you know, when countries such as Brazil and Argentina and Venezuela, but others as well, Colombia, Peru, Chile, were kind of, you know, entered modernity and embraced this particular art form as kind of the visual, as the visual paradigm that embodied the spirit of hope that comes with the idea of modernity and modernism. You know, it's an optimistic art, and it's an art work. It's an art form that's interested in ideas of joy and pleasure. I mean, of course, this is the reason why it has often been pushed aside as entertainment, because it's art that wanted to kind of, you know, uplift. And this is part of the reason why it was marginalized so easily. But for me, and that's why I think this artwork matters today. Some of it comes across as naive and corny, and perhaps even ridiculous. Some of it is. But you know what? What's wrong with that, actually? Nothing wrong with something wanting to really kind of appeal to our more naive sense of experience. So that's, in the, you know, my short and subjective impression of why it matters now, because of its hopefulness in, you know, a dark age.
I would agree with that, but I would add that it's not just about hope, but it's a you know, we work in contemporary art museums, and contemporary art can be very cynical, and these artists were deeply invested in doing something new, trying to do something new, and also trying to kind of harness the potential of the art object to make change. So not just that it was about joy, but it was also about affecting positive change, and doing that in with a collective spirit, which is also something that contemporary art is really not about. It's much more individualistic, and you know, it's refreshing as an historian and a curator to work with artists like this, with objects like this, that are meant to actually do something, or are hoped to do something. And that's, again, you know, the reason that they've been that I think they're fundamentally misunderstood. And so it's a joy to kind of try and recapture some of that spirit in 2018, when things are seemingly a little bit grim globally.
And one more thing that I wanted to add is also that, and this is a point that, you know, Abby often makes in her own art historical research. I mean, this is also a very, like a deeply like a fundamentally democratic art form. You know, here's an art made by artists who did not require their public or audience to come armed with a deep understanding of art history. Like, basically the appeal that this work made was very often on the most fundamental level of experience and perception. So it's art. It's in many ways art for the people in, you know, in the language that we have come to distrust, right? It's popular art, and again, this is of course the reason why it was perhaps so easily disqualified as serious art, because, you know, art critics in the West and New York elitists were perhaps found it suspicious that it had this popular appeal. But popular appeal was, of course, the whole point of it. And this is also why so many of these artists worked in the public sphere. Soto, Carlos Cruz Diaz. I mean, these are artists whose work was made in a way for the communal experience of public space. And of course, you know, in the cynical West, this was always kind of looked at with suspicion. After the experience of the Second World War, which was, you know, kind of this consummating moment of ideological warfare.
I just wanted to add something in terms of being this art is being majorly misunderstood, or this movement, which I totally agree. And in my mind, the way that, you know, I think they keep asking me, so where is it now? Where is kinetic and op art now? And I keep saying that it's not gone anywhere. It's just dissolved. We just don't call it anymore that way. It was the precedent of many art forms that now we call differently. Participatory art, we call it, media art, science art. It was, so in a way, I think 2018, apart from the fact maybe resurrecting social utopia in art and the power of art, it's also good to see where it came from. In a way, it reminds us that before it got dissolved, and this is why I think we also kept the historical line quite clear in terms of, because now we can talk about kinetic art in discotheques, and and stuff, but it's not the point. It's not the same, That was, and so it's good to be reminded of the motivations, let's say.
No, and what Dieter just said about you can also think about these artists or this work as institutional critique before there was institutional critique, or installation before that installation was something that we talked about. In a lot of ways, these artists are the foreshadowing what will happen in the West in the 70s, or what will become popular, in a different language, obviously. And just because it's about joy, and just because it's about being democratic and being participatory, doesn't mean it's not critical. So giving it back some of its criticality is also important.
Yeah, I don't know if you want to comment this, especially, I don't know, how from your, I mean, I guess at some point it comes down to what is the difference, because op art and kinetic was also, mostly what we know, the dominant, let's say, narrative from Western Europe and, Northern America. So what can you kind of give the synthesis of, I don't know, because we don't have much time, but of what is the fundamental difference between how artists took this? Because for me, it's not, what I understood is really, I don't know why, but I don't feel that joy at all. I feel like, not maybe, I feel a super a desire to mobilize the audience by making them, giving them back again the power of the eye. That the eye is a reflexive faculty of the human, who is actually a very active, not passive receptor. And by doing this, and by telling your body is also responsible for the finishing of the artwork, or your body is responsible for making this work even work, it kind of gives you the power, back to you, to the individual, to maybe make some social changes later. I don't know if that happened, but
for me, this project seems very important in relation to this narratives of art history, and what could be called these parallel histories, and also which includes that sometimes we can, when we really can watch on the same thing and have these different stories, like Dieter has the story of joy, of pleasure, and we from this former Soviet context, we see there maybe some other emphasis, and I think, yeah, it is so important to have these parallel histories on the table, like where it's, instead of this really like choosing one focus, but really like to see this multiplicity and this diversity, which is still belongs to somehow to the same epoch, to the same. Also like kinetic art, it's very in relation to the art. It is so important, this Cold War context, because like this. Technologically, the synthesis of technologies and science and art, it was related to this also the competition between the the power structures, and somehow how art was also instrumentalized, and at the same time also how art was taking its own kind of agendas in this basically a very political framework. And also I wanted to add one thing, which is maybe a little deviation, but in Latvia, we somehow, for us, since mid 2000s, it's been really kind of this, as also the same as understood, and I guess it's for all Eastern Europe, especially this revisiting history context, and And in Latvian Center for Contemporary Arts, where I work, we initiated the project, which was, the title was given the Recuperating the Invisible Past. So in a way that really like getting back to this, the kind of, this art which has been forgotten, which has been kind of marginalized and brought to the complete peripheries, and but also like with the wish to really see it in its complexity. And I think also this is the art which has those many layers, and where, as Sasha already like mentioned, that it was not belonging neither to the official nor to really this underground or unofficial art. And when we look also like how it was in Moscow, how it was in Russia in general, how it was in the Baltic states, how it was in the Eastern Europe, there is like these really like parallel narratives, but they have slight differences, and I think it's always important to see these differences and not to kind of just to try to wrap up in one very general narrative. And I think that's in a way this art tells this really complex stories, and also like that really like it was also like in the guided tour we had in the morning. I was happy to see the work by Valdis Telms, and in a way this here it's really like placed in this context of this joyful pleasure story. But when I remember this original context, how the work was. How it was originating in a way, and I just will quickly mention this historical aspect. So it was the exhibition with the title Celebrations, and it was really like seminal exhibitions for Latvia, for Riga, and it was actually I would say only one really large group show of kinetic art in Latvia in 1972. But it happened that it was set of many exhibitions of young artists of that time. Many of them were still students, and that was basically the students of design and interior departments in Art Academy. And so they were really like experimenting a lot. They were really like willing to in a way also like maybe to break some boundaries which could be broken still in the official context. But the way why they managed to do such exhibition was that they positioned that this is the exhibition which is celebrating the anniversary of 50 years of Soviet Union, and that was kind of the bringing the legality or the legal way why something like that could happen. And in a way, in this Eastern European history, it has this political subversive context, which is completely different if we would look from some other.
With quotations from Vladimir Lenin, which opened every Soviet kinetic art exhibition.
But at the same
art
time
belongs
also,
to people. Right?
Yeah, but at the same time, this celebrations, it was really ambiguous meaning, and they were really like playing with this ambiguity.
And in South America, you're talking about Argentina, Venezuela, Brazil. You're also talking about countries people working in a state of dictatorship, and with artists in exile in Paris. So I don't think that who said it, the root of all comedy is tragedy, right? So even if it looks joyful, the underlying situation is obviously difficult in all of these contexts, and it's also a question about what you can say, what you can't say, and obviously what you can do with abstraction is say a lot that you can't say literally. So we shouldn't leave anybody with the impression that any of this work is not meant to be a serious comment on what's happening in the social situations in all of these contexts.
But
yeah,
I just thought about what you just said. One art historian said it was like 30 years ago. Thanks God, these artists didn't have a capital to realize all their ideas. Because, one of them wrote in 60s, I would love to paint with a cosmic plasma and moving oceans and reconstruct the starry sky in my own way of seeing the harmony. But in the same time, yes, they really had no money. And if you see the technological background of all Soviet works, at least, it's an arte povera, really. It's made of nothing, really. So in technological way, it's very poor, but ideologically, it's really strong and...
Sasha was saying when we were talking before, imagine if Tatlin had the plexiglass. So what he could do. So.
Yeah. I mean, one more thing, or just to kind of circle back to this question of why it matters, why it's worth looking at again. Certainly, I'm interested in the position of openness that many of these artists assumed vis-a-vis the complex of science and engineering and all that, and this kind of this desire to integrate human endeavor. But I'm also sympathetic in a lot of this work with this not disregard for the author or the artist as the individual genius behind the work. But certainly, it's kind of scaling back a little bit, and as you pointed out yourself, I mean, where is kinetic art now, or where is op art now? The answer is perhaps in Olafur Eliasson. Maybe Olafur Eliasson is today's kinetic or is an op artist, really. So that's where you see influence, and certainly when Jesus Rafael Soto started to develop his penetrables, an example of which is installed at the very beginning of the exhibition here at the very entrance of the garage, inviting people to actually go through. I mean, this is a very early example of art that really invites people to kind of interact with it very directly and very personally. And to my knowledge, I don't know of many precedents in art history before that, really. And this this emphasis on interactivity, this very early emphasis on interactivity, and interactivity is something that we now, often take for granted in the artistic context. Relational aesthetics, all that. Today, everywhere each museum you enter, there's always somebody who asks you to skateboard and kind of dress up and eat and whatever. But 30, 40, 50 years ago, when this paradigm was first developed, this was completely novel, and of course, behind this mission of interactivity, there was a desire, I think, on the part of the artists to move a little bit away from this centralist ideology of artistic ego, which was, of course, incredibly present in existing doctrines of expression. Right? We were, the standard history of Western art, and with Western art I mean art as we know it. I don't just mean geographically Western art, but the standard narrative of art history is always kind of locked up in this idea of individual expression, and obviously these artists were individuals, and these artists were interested in expressing themselves, but they were also, more importantly, interested in broadening the scope of artistic creation to become something a little more communal than just, the personal experience of one ego in a studio. And this is also why so many of these works were made in collaboration with engineers and scientists. And these are also habits of mind that we've lost and that we sometimes, find again. And there too, I find, like kind of like the optimistic tenor of much of the work. But, if you kind of think about the death of the author and, the end or the death of the subject as these quintessential myths of early postmodern philosophy, France in the late 60s and early 70s, it's foreshadowed in many ways in work that we see here, where the artist kind of wants to disappear into the backdrop and kind of, let the viewer take over. And this this again is something that I value and we value. This, kind of shifting of the emphasis of aesthetic experience to the viewer, to the visitor, which is us, because none of us are artists, right? Snejana, are you secretly an artist?
But no, that's there's so many people that are better than me. No, I wanted to ask a bit of a, I don't know if it's a stupid question or, but all these artists were somehow appealing to their avant-garde and what they call they're all different, obviously, in different contexts, but the early avant-gardes from the 20th century, the constructivists, and I mean, obviously there was also this, especially in our context where utopia was, big thing, changing societies, changing people's mind, new race, exploration of space, etc. So that existed already then, the synthesis of arts and the desire so I wonder what, and it's like in the Russian context we call it like the second avant-garde, or that's one of the ways of calling like non-conformist art from the 60s. And so I wonder what. Do you think something we have stepped with that a step further than the avant-garde and what they wanted to achieve and they couldn't? I think the utopia was somehow cut. Maybe, is this the unrealized utopian project of?
Well, I mean, of course, op art. If one of the definitions of the utopian impulse in art, if you think about, Tatlin in particular, people like Tatlin in particular, or also, Dada in Western Europe in the 10s. One of the basic definitions of the utopian impulses in art is the dissolution of art into life. I mean, surely this is something that op art managed to achieve, because by the time that op art hit MoMA in 1966, it had become basically fashion, right? 65, like all of a sudden people walked around in op art dresses, and Victor Vasarely, who is a great Hungarian French op artist, by the time. Sometime by the late 70s or early 80s, he was mostly remembered for his wallpaper design. And of course, this was this was one of the reasons why he was so easily kind of, again, disqualified by the critical art establishment, because, his work, managed to make it into everyday interior design. And so in a sense, you could say that op art, somewhat cynically, fulfilled the utopian promise. But of course, also by being absorbed quite easily in consumer society and consumer culture. So, the jury's out a little bit there. I think there's a lot of ambiguity. And of course, a lot of the work here has a propositional status more than anything else. I mean, so much of it is models. And this is especially true, I think, of much of the Russian work, the Dvizhenye group. Like a lot of it is dreams, right? It's sketches for big things that ideally would materialize, and models for this and models for that, and so many of the machines are so badly designed because, of course, there was always the hope that someday they'll have the means to actually do it like they wanted to. And so a lot of the work is, I think that a lot of these people knew that they were after the unrealizable. And basically comforted themselves with the language of the model and the maquette and the proposal, So that's, again, I think, an important aspect of the work.
Yes, and you absolutely right. Talking about this far future where all our dreams will be realized, why should we spend time to realize one detail of one working machine? And the project of Nussberg, actually, the last one, which is here called Artificial Bionico-Kinetic Environment, it will work in it was supposed to start working in 2020. So the time has not come yet.
Almost there. Well, who knows?
We're almost there.
But maybe he's digging underground already.
Yeah, and
we just don't know about
this
it.
environment should have occupied several a dozen of square kilometers of the earth up there and beneath. So yes, there was this projection of absolutely unknown and impossible future. But in the same time, if we talk about local art history, kinetic artists were real second avant-garde. First of all, because they were responsible for elimination from their, at least, horizon, all traces of what we call easel painting. They stopped thinking in traditional way. They turned to object, not as a kind of something instead of sculpture, but just thought about art piece as something which doesn't belong to aesthetical realm. And that's why probably they were first who started using photos as a piece of visual culture, and they were first artists which turned to performance as a technology of expression. So in our situation, these artists were real avant-gardists.
I would also like to add again from this our kind of my research and this local history of the Baltic art, that in a way I definitely see this parallel, this pure curiosity about the avant-garde art. But in a way, it is still choosing these ideas and sometimes really continuing from that particular point in the 20s, like as a next step in the 70s. Kind of agenda is different, so the ideas and maybe this initial point, the starting point is really the same, but somehow, as I sometimes call it, it's like cooled down avant-gardism. It doesn't have anymore this really, at least in when I have to speak about the Latvian artists, this really cosmic dimension. It's more like back to the ground, where they really like combine this. Imagination, but somehow this imagination is really like coupled with the reality. And again, what I see it is as this context of Eastern European and also this former Soviet art in kinetic, this field. It had its really like critical dimension. It was, as we know, that art couldn't be purely like openly critical, and then the artist had to find the ways how to really like include it as a subtext, this criticality, or really like skepticism of the political reality. Then somehow it was really through these visionary proposals, but somehow they were really like proposals about the public space, about some kind of possible scenarios, but somehow they were they were really like still related to this to the ground. And again, just as an example, like Latvian artists, they were extremely interested in this also this legacy of constructivism, also in a way because this included also some seminal Latvian artists like Gustavs Klucis and Kārlis Johansons. And then there is this very beautiful work by Valdis Celms. It's not in this exhibition, but so he did it together with another artist and another architect, also as a collective work. And as initial or starting point, they chose a sketch from Gustavs Klucis, which was, if you start to analyze, it's not just construction or composition, but it's really like a possible kinetic object. But for Gustavs Klucis in these early 20s, it was just maybe there's some experiment of his thinking. And then they picked up this really like simple sketch and developed from it a very elaborated proposal, which they called the lighthouse. They even settled it as a proposal in a very particular place in a Riga city, like public space. And through this really, which was in a way like laboratory of kinetics, of kineticism, they at the same time also like came up with kind of analysis of the city. seeing the problematics, like for example this old part of the town and the new one, they are not connected at all, and through this really like visionary, very kind of, we can say, avant-garde project, they proposed how to really like solve these problems in a reality. Of course, it stayed as a paper architecture.
By the way, Valdis is coming to Moscow
Yeah, I'm
in
very
April.
happy.
So me too, and Artur Rinkis as well. So yeah, super happy too. So you can listen from him, directly as well, the stories. I just wanted to maybe finish up and then open for questions, and I hope you have. By the way, do you have questions between? Because maybe you want to ask some questions to each other. No? Everything clear?
It's so unclear that everything is unclear.
No, I just wanted to say that the exhibition will travel in Sao Paulo. So it started in Warsaw, it came through Moscow. It will, and I think there will all be 3 very different exhibitions with the same works. It's amazing, actually, how much you can, So it was very interesting for me, at least. But yeah, I just wanted to then open to questions from the audience.
Hello, here comes my question. It was mentioned the kinetic art objects, and they are not just the structures made of metal and steel, and this is interaction with the viewer. This is the core, but some of your objects, they are untouchable, but they are meant to be touched, to be tuned away. In other museums it is allowed to touch, but why it is not allowed to touch them here? Why you deprive the viewer from having a touch, a feel of the art object? Let me answer this question. Many of the art objects that are so-called untouchable, they are a part of museum collections. They are museum exhibits. Museums, they are collections of art, and they treasure their art objects and exhibits, and any touch to the museum exhibits might damage them. This is the reason why. The steel, they are made of steel. Steel is very durable. I can agree with you, but I've been working with kinetic art for a long time. They are very fragile, considering the fact what they were made of back in the 60s. They are fragile.
Well, there's a piece outside just here by Lydia Clark. She's a Brazilian artist. It's called a bicho. It's which animal, beast, creature, critter, and it's a modular steel structure. And it was really, when she made it, it was really meant to be manipulated by the audience. And of course, it's the tragedy of this art is that we no longer live or that this is no longer possible because perhaps because museums are much more crowded than they used to be. I don't know. But of course, I mean, for me, or from my perspective, like the way out of this conundrum, you like these early examples of interactive art that you no longer can interact with, which is of course a problem. But the way out of this conundrum is of course to make exhibition copies. Like facsimile objects that really where people are invited to do this. And this is something that, for instance, is standard practice with certain works by Elio Oiticica. There's a film in the exhibition that shows Elio Oiticica work, parangoles, and they're basically paintings that you can wear. They're capes, they're clothing items, but really paintings. And so the Oiticica estate, the family of Elio Oiticica, basically produces for exhibitions around the world up-to-date, present-day replicas of these parangoles that people are invited to wear. So this, many of these artists were not necessarily that interested in the unique object or in this auratic artwork. Very often they made things that they wanted to see go out into the world. And I think that museum practice, we should try to make that happen. And perhaps, in Sao Paulo, we can make a bicho that people then can touch,
Yes, and do you remember this black spiral, the very tiny black object in the Akulinin? Yes. And he said, why nobody can touch this? Because I couldn't buy a rotor when I was young. So I was standing nearby and twisted it every half an hour. Why don't we do it nowadays? And I had to tell him that, Tretyakov Gallery now owns it. And
yeah, I mean, this is the thing. Artists may want one thing, but the museums definitely want something else. And this is, of course,
But when we did an exhibition performance in Russia 3 years ago, we had several objects. We were replicas, and audience could interact. Maybe it's a solution for the next time.
Today, when I lead tours, the first thing I say is that I'm very, very sorry, but none of the objects you see can be touched. And I apologize, but I don't know on behalf of whom, but I guess it's just very sad that museums really do this, but otherwise we won't have much culture left. But at the same time, I am a big fan of reconstructions and replicas, especially of objects that, you no longer be able to even see. We had a few photographs, for example, of Grigoriev's work that is hanged, the big one photograph. Thanks God he's still alive, but if we didn't, But so I think it's important to do this kind of reconstruction and replicas, so then you can give back life to these objects. But today I still had critique from a gentleman who was part of the tour saying, well, I don't believe you anymore in your museum because you show not original things, and what is this replicas and da-da-da. So
where is the value? Value is the most important thing, not the movement. For some people. Yeah.
Sometimes, the aura of is still present. Obviously, it's you can't.
No, this is why we go to museums to experience aura.
Yeah. But at some other times, the general idea is more important than the aura of the object. Any other questions? No. Yeah, let's go see some. Okay, well, if you don't have any questions, thank you so much for listening, for attending, and for being so attention.
Спасибо большое.